Chapter 2. A strangely sent epistle. Zuleika, Monte-Cristo's daughter, had been for some months in the convent school conducted by the Sisterhood of the Sacred Heart. She was not a close student, though a rapid learner, and was rather inclined to romance and adventure than to musty books of history and science. As has already been stated, she had the early maturity of Greek girls. Besides, she had attracted the attention of several Roman youths of high and noble lineage, who had eagerly paid her the homage due to her beauty and oriental attractiveness. Though but 15, she appreciated and felt flattered by this homage, and naturally was impatient of the restraint put upon her by the regulations of the convent school, which rigorously excluded all male visitors save parents or guardians. In the first rank of her youthful admirers was the Viscount Giovanni Massetti. He was more ardent than any of the rest, and indeed was desperately in love with the fair and bewitching child of the dead heyday. He belonged to a family of great antiquity and boundless wealth, and was reputed to possess a vast fortune in his own right. The Viscount was only in his 21st year, but was exceedingly manly, dashing, and gallant. He was quite handsome, and was said to be the soul of honor, though his ardent temperament and headlong pursuit of whatever he most coveted not unfrequently involved him in serious troubles, from which, thanks to his own tact and the vast influence of his family, he generally came out unscathed. On Zuleika's arrival in Rome, and before she had been placed in the convent school, the Viscount Massetti had made her acquaintance in a way that savored of romance, and that made a deep impression upon the inexperienced young girl. In Monte Cristo's carriage, attended only by a timid femme de chambre, she was one day crossing one of the two bridges leading to the island of San Bartolomeo, when a trace broke and the horses took fright. The terrified driver lost control of them, and the mad animals dashed along at a fearful rate, almost overturning the carriage. Zuleika had arisen in the vehicle, which was an open barouche, and was wildly clinging to the back of the front seat, her face white with fear, and her long black hair, which had become loosened, streaming out behind her. Her wide open eyes had in them a look of tearful supplication most difficult to resist. The young Viscount, who was riding over the bridge on horseback at the time of the accident, could not resist it. He sprang from his horse, and, as the carriage passed him, leaped into it. Seizing Zuleika by the waist and holding her tightly to him, he then made another spring, alighting safely with her upon the roadway of the bridge. The flying horses were ultimately stopped, and the occupants of the badly shattered vehicle rescued from their dangerous situation. This adventure caused the Count of Monte Cristo to throw open the doors of his palazzo to the young Italian, and he had been a frequent visitor there up to the time of Zuleika's departure for the convent school. In the interval, both the Viscount and the girl had become much attached to each other, and then this mutual attachment had rapidly ripened into mutual love of that ardor and intensity experienced only by children of the southern or oriental sun. Young Massetti had avowed his passion to his beautiful charmer, and the avowal had not caused her displeasure. It was, on the contrary, exceedingly agreeable to her, and she did not seek to conceal the fact from her enthusiastic suitor. The momentous interview took place in a densely shaded alley of the garden of the Palazzo Costi, one sultry afternoon of the early autumn. The youthful couple were seated very near each other upon a rustic bench. Massetti held Zuleika's small, soft hand in his, and the electric touch of her tiny and shapely fingers thrilled him as the touch of female fingers had never thrilled him before. He gazed into the liquid depths of her dark, glowing eyes, and their subtle fires seemed to melt his very soul. The close, sultry atmosphere, laden with heavy, intoxicating perfumes, was fraught with a delirious influence, well calculated to set the blood aflame and promote the explosion of pent-up love. The thick green foliage enclosed the pair as in a verdant cloud, effectually concealing them from observation. The opportunity was irresistible. Giovanni drew closer to his fascinating companion, so closely that her fragrant breath came full in his face, utterly subjecting him and totally obliterating all caution, everything save his absorbing passion for the palpitating girl, whose slight but clear-cut form, gracefully outlined beneath her flowing half-oriental garments, touched his. Suddenly carried away by a powerful transport, he threw his arm around the young girl's yielding waist and drew her without resistance upon his bosom, where she lay, gazing up into his flushed, excited countenance with an indescribable voluptuous charm, mingled with thorough confidence and unhesitating innocence. Panting in his clasp, her ruby lips partly opened as if for breath, and the ardent Italian hastily, recklessly imprinted a fiery kiss upon them. Zuleika, with an almost imperceptible movement, returned this chaste but ravishing salute. "Oh, how I love you!" murmured Giovanni, quivering from head to foot in his wild ecstasy and clasping the lovely girl still tighter. She made no verbal response, but did not stir, did not strive to extricate herself from his warm embrace. This was a sufficient answer for the quick Italian. Zuleika, the beautiful Zuleika, returned his love, favored his suit. His joy approached delirium. "Oh, Zuleika," he whispered, gazing directly into her night-black eyes, "you love me, I am sure. Give me the treasures of your virgin heart. Be mine, be my wife." "Oh, Giovanni," returned the quivering girl in a low but sweetly modulated voice, "I do love you. God alone knows how much, but I am too young to be your wife. I am only a child, not yet out of school. My father would not hear of my marrying for several years to come. Can you not wait?" "It will be a hard task, Zuleika," answered the young man excitedly, "but still I will wait if you give me a lover's hope. Promise to marry me when you are at liberty to do so, nay, swear it, and I shall be satisfied." "I can neither promise nor swear it, Giovanni, without my father's approval and consent. He is a wise, experienced and thoughtful man, tender and mild to every one he loves, though hard and implacable to his enemies. Speak to him of me, of your love, of your wish. He will listen to you, and he will not imperil his daughter's happiness. Go to him without delay, and rest assured that whatever he says or does will be for the best interests of us both." She had released herself from his clasp and drawn slightly away from him, not in terror, not in prudery, not in coquetry, but as a measure of prudence. She felt intuitively that the wild, intense passion of her Italian adorer must be kept within discreet limits. "I cannot speak to your father yet," replied Giovanni, hesitatingly. "He might listen to me, it is true, but he would treat our love as a mere childish fancy that time could not fail to dim, if not obliterate. I am deeply in earnest, Zuleika, and could not bear to be treated as a thoughtless, headlong stripling who did not know his own mind. Ridicule, even in its mildest form, would fire my blood, fill me with mad projects of revenge. I prefer not to ask your father for your hand until certain of a favorable reception of my suit. You comprehend my scruples, do you not, Zuleika? I love you too dearly not to win you when I ask." "But you will speak to my father?" said the girl, in faltering tones. "Yes, darling, oh, yes, but not until that hated convent school has ceased to oppose its barriers between us. When you have left it, when you have completed the education the Count designs for you, I will seek your father and ask you of him for my wife. Until then, until I can with safety speak, at least promise me that you will love no other man, encourage no other suitor." "That I will do," responded the girl, joyously. "Rest assured I will love no other man, encourage no other suitor." Unable to control himself, the Viscount again clasped the object of his adoration in his arms, and again their lips met in a long, passionate kiss of love. So it was settled, and Zuleika went to the convent school of the Sacred Heart, feeling that her happiness was assured, but impatient of and dissatisfied with the long delay that must necessarily intervene before the realization of her hopes, the dawn of her woman's future. The Viscount Massetti, though he had professed himself willing to wait, was, on his side, thoroughly discontented with the arduous task he had undertaken. It was one thing to make a rash promise in the heat of enthusiasm, but quite another to keep it, especially when that promise involved a separation from the lovely girl who had inextricably entwined herself about the fibers of his heart and was the sole guiding star of his life and love. The convent school of the Sacred Heart was located in the convent of that sisterhood, about 3 miles beyond the Porta del Popolo, on the northern side of Rome. The convent was a spacious edifice, but gloomy and forbidding, with the aspect of a prison. Narrow, barred windows, like those of a dungeon of the Middle Ages, admitted the light from without, furnishing a dim, restricted illumination that gave but little evidence of the power and brilliancy of the orb of day. At night the faint sepulchral blaze of candles only served to make the darkness palpable and more ghastly. The huge schoolroom was as primitive and comfortless in its appointments and furniture as well could be. The walls were of dressed stone and loomed up, bare and grisly, to a lofty ceiling that was covered with a perfect labyrinth of curiously carved beams, the work of some unknown artist of long ago. The scholars' dormitories were narrow, cell-like affairs, scantily furnished, in which every light must be extinguished at the hour of 9 in the evening. Once admitted to the school, the pupils were not permitted to leave its precincts, save at vacation or at the termination of their course of studies, a circumstance that heartily disgusted the gay, light-hearted Italian girls sent there to receive both mental and moral training. Another source of grave vexation to them was the regulation, already alluded to, that rigorously excluded all male visitors, with the exception of parents or guardians. Attached to the convent was an extensive garden, full of huge trees that had apparently stood there for centuries, so bent, gnarled, and aged were they. An ancient gardener, with a flowing beard as white as snow, and scanty locks of the same spotless hue, aided by 2 or 3 assistants, almost as ancient as himself, attended to the lawns and vast flower beds, the latter being kept constantly filled with plants of gorgeous bloom and exquisite fragrance. The picturesque appearance of the garden contrasted strongly and strangely with the rigid and staid aspect of the convent edifice, and this garden was the one spot where the pupils felt at home and thoroughly enjoyed themselves. They were allowed to walk there at noon and towards twilight in the evening, under the supervision of Sister Agatha, a sharp-sighted and vigilant nun, who never failed to rebuke and correct her vivacious charges for even the slightest infraction of discipline. Still, the girls enjoyed themselves in the garden, for its extent and the fact that Sister Agatha could not be everywhere at once enabled the frisky and light-hearted pupils to indulge in many an escapade. One noon Zuleika, who was in an unusually despondent frame of mind, strayed from the rest of her companions and strolled beneath the centenarian trees. Unconsciously she approached the lofty wall of the garden. She seated herself at the foot of a gnarled old elm, the leafy branches of which descended to the ground and effectually screened Monte-Cristo's daughter from view. At least so she thought. But though she could not be seen by any within the garden enclosure, she was plainly visible from the wall and the trees looming above it without. As Zuleika sat pondering on her lot and sadly thinking of her separation from her lover, she heard, or imagined she heard, a singular noise amid the thick boughs of an immense chestnut tree immediately outside the garden wall. She started up in a fright, but could discern nothing unusual, and the singular noise was not repeated. The strangest part of the whole affair, however, was that the noise had sounded like her own name, uttered by a human voice. This increased her terror and confusion, and she was about to flee from the spot when an oblong pebble, to which something white was attached, fluttered over the wall and fell at her feet. She was now more alarmed than ever, and took several steps backward, the while regarding the white object that lay where it had fallen, motionless and fascinating. Finally, her curiosity obtained the mastery, and approaching the suspicious object with the utmost caution, she bent over to examine it. It was an ordinary envelope, and no doubt contained a letter. For whom was it intended? Obviously for one of the pupils. It was a clandestine epistle, too, otherwise it would have come by the regular channel, through the post office. Perhaps it was a love letter. At this thought she gave a guilty start, and gazed piercingly into the chestnut tree, but nothing was visible there, save boughs and leaves. After all, the epistle was, doubtless, destined for some swarthy-visaged Italian beauty, and many such were in the convent school. That it had fallen at her feet was certainly but a mere coincidence. It could not be intended for her. Its rightful owner, who had clearly received many similar notes in the same way, knew where it was, and presently would come for it. The envelope had fallen face downward, and she could not see the address. She touched it with her foot, then cautiously turned it with the tip of her shoe. She saw writing. It was the address. Somehow the arrangement of the characters seemed familiar to her, though she was so dazed and confused she could not make out the name. Her curiosity was unworthy of her, she knew, unworthy of Monte-Cristo's daughter. What right had she to pry into the heart secret of one of her school companions? Still she gazed. She could not help it. Suddenly she stooped and took the envelope from the ground. The address riveted her eyes like a magician's spell. Great heavens! It was her own name, Zuleika! Hurriedly snapping the slight string that bound the envelope to the stone, she thrust the former into the bosom of her dress. Then she glanced around her, half fearing she had been seen by some of the pupils or the watchful Sister Agatha. But no, she was unobserved, and even now her companions and the nun were at such a distance that she could read her letter without the slightest danger of being discovered or interrupted. The temptation was strong. She yielded to it. She would read the letter. She felt convinced that it was from the Viscount Massetti, and the conviction filled her with unutterable joy. She had not heard a word concerning him since she had been immured within the sombre walls of that dismal convent, and now she had tidings of him in his own handwriting. It was rapture. What had he written to her? An assurance of his love, no doubt, and perhaps an exhortation to her to keep her part of their agreement, to love no other man, to encourage no other suitor. Surely she loved no one else. She never could love any one but Giovanni Massetti, for did he not possess her whole heart, all the wealth of her ardent youthful affection? She kissed the envelope, then opened it, took out the letter, which was written in pencil, and read: "Dearest Zuleika, I can keep from you no longer. I must see you once more, and again call you my own. I strove to attract your attention just now in the chestnut tree outside the wall. I uttered your beloved name, but you did not seem to understand me. This evening at twilight I will scale the wall. At that time be at the elm where you now stand, and I will meet you there. Do not fail me, and above all, do not be afraid. I assure you that no harm can possibly befall either of us. Meet me, darling, your own Giovanni." Zuleika stood staring at this passionate note with sensations made up of amazement, rapture, and dismay. Giovanni, her lover, was coming. He would stand there on that very spot, and she would see him in all the glory of his youthful manhood, with the radiant love light in his eyes. But how if he were discovered? What then would become of him and of her? She shuddered at the possibilities of danger, but on one point she was resolved: she would meet him, let the danger be what it might. How Giovanni would manage to avoid observation she did not know, but she would trust to his judgment and discretion. She glanced in the direction of the pupils and Sister Agatha. They were coming slowly towards her. Again secreting her lover's epistle in her bosom, she went to meet them. End of chapter 2.